Hey guys, welcome back. Yesterday, right after I finished making my VTOL video, I went and I saw Avatar 2: Way of the Water. And really, it made me think about how remarkably similar the gunships appeared to the Falcon. And it honestly took me back because that's how I felt after I saw the first movie and then played Halo Reach. And so it inspired me to do a deep dive, and I went down the rabbit hole and I found a lot of similarities that I thought were interesting. And so today, I'm going to show you guys the ways that James Cameron and his films, in my opinion, have inspired the designs behind Halo. Long before Avatar, James Cameron had a number of successful films. Obviously, one that many of us have heard of is Aliens, released in 1986.
Mark.
Many of you probably already know this, but Aliens was a massive inspiration for the attire and attitudes of Marines in Halo CE. Before their changes in the anniversary edition of the game, they had that kind of classic olive drab green, Vietnam, boonie hat wearing vibe to them. And it wasn't just their appearance. If you look at how they conducted business, they had that kind of campy macho attitude, very reminiscent of the Colonial Marines and Aliens. And honestly, if you want to see more like a deeper dive comparison, Late Night Gaming actually has a terrific series where he explores that, so I'm not going to belabor the point too much there. Instead, I'm going to focus on the aircraft, which I typically like to do. If you look at the dropship from Aliens, as many commenters have actually pointed out on my various Pelican videos, it's incredibly similar and comparable. Aliens is a sci-fi classic that would have released during the teen years of the developers at Bungie, so it's easy and kind of not surprising to see why the movie would play a potential inspirational role for the atmosphere and appearance they were pursuing for the UNSC. But beyond just Aliens, he also made another very impactful sequel, Terminator 2: Judgment Day, which came out in 1991. Terminator 2 features a scene where humanity and the robots are fighting in the future, and it's one of the first times we see the HK Aerial. It's a large tilt-jet aircraft drone that systematically hunts down humanity. And to the best of my knowledge, it's one of the first kind of tilt-jet appearances we ever see in mainstream media. And it stood out to me when I saw the movie as a kid about how kind of different it was. Bringing it forward into the kind of modern time frame, when the first Avatar came out in 2009, obviously it was a massive box office hit. Most of us were probably adults or teenagers at the time and remember how crazy everyone was about the movie. It really had a lasting impact. So is it that surprising that a year later, when Halo Reach came out, the Falcon had a habit of looking very, very similar to the gunships we see in the movies? And really, each of these movies achieved significant success. Each of them influenced culture, particularly in the sci-fi world, and each of them, may have had a role influencing Halo. But what inspired them then from the real world? As you know I like to do, I'm going to find some real world aircraft examples. For tilt jets, you have something like the VJ-101. It was a tilt jet modification to the F-101 Century series of fighters. It's honestly the first and possibly only fighter style aircraft I was able to find with engines at the wingtips that pivoted, like a tilt jet. Keep in mind, when I say tilt jet, it's just that. It's like when I say tilt rotor, the engines actually tilt. You have things like tilt wing, which is kind of rare and only really done in tests where the wings themselves would move. But being a tilt jet, it has those engines kind of way out there. And really, when you look at that and look at the HK Aerial, I feel like you can definitely see some similarities. And between those two, with the VJ-101 being designed in the 60s, I really couldn't think of many other circumstances where a design like that was showcased. In a similar vein, last video we talked about the V-22 family. And the development of that for the Osprey started all the way back in 1981. Well, those were inspired by the XV-15, a tilt rotor kind of demonstration design in 1972 by Bell and Textron. And those themselves were actually built off of research that began all the way back in 1947 with the Model 1 Golf. And that was all exploring that kind of tilt rotor design to give you that short or vertical takeoff and landing capability. Well, what about the dropship? Is there anything like that, from what we see in Aliens that we could see in the real world? Well, this is actually one that I could not find really anything that had a comparable real world counterpart. In my opinion, the dropship, as we see it in Aliens, is a completely novel and new design, which can't be that surprising. Like, you don't become a Hollywood set designer and stuff like that if you weren't capable of coming up with cool designs on your own. So how does Halo and James Cameron movies tie it all together? Well, like we mentioned with the Marines, there's a lot of similarities there, but beyond just kind of appearance and how they conduct themselves, the Pelican, in my opinion, has clear roots to the dropship from Aliens. And honestly, many of y'all have pointed that out to me, and I agree. And then, like, when you look at it from a common sense perspective, I mean, Halo C came out in 2001? So it's only 15 years older than the Aliens movie. And like I said, most of the developers were probably teenagers when it came out and were heavily inspired by what they saw. When you roll it forward a little bit and you look at Terminator 2 coming out in 1991, only 10 years before CE, now you have the HK Aerial. And like I said, it's a very unique design with those big turbojet engines at the wingtips. The only real-world comparable I saw was the VJ101, but what about in the Halo series of games? Well, honestly, I think it's the most similar to the Hornet, albeit at a much smaller scale. The Hornet's not very large, but it was one of the first vehicles I remember distinctly as a teenager seeing in video games that had engines like that all the way out the wingtips. And really, between that and the HK Aerial, I couldn't think of very many other examples. And for those of you out there who maybe have, I mean, feel free to leave me a comment, but I truly believe that the Hornet and its, Halo 3 was released in 2007. In many ways, I could see how Bungie would have been inspired by the Terminator series of movies, and that kind of helped play a role when they designed the Hornet. Last but not least, we have the Avatar Gunships and the Falcon. I feel like this one is the easiest one to connect the dots, and it's also the easiest timeline to kind of see how things may have played out. If you look at it, Halo Reach released only a year after Avatar, and you have to keep in mind this was a time frame where Bungie was actually releasing Halo games pretty frequently, like every 2 to 3 years or shorter. Halo 3 came out in 2007, ODST released in 2009, and then in 2010 you had Halo Reach, only a year after the Avatar movie first came out. And so it's easy to see how those two designs would have, influenced each other. And really, to break it down more specifically, if you look at the gunship in Avatar, its engines are kind of, they're centerline mounted on the fuselage, and they have a gear shaft that goes out to the props they're contained in a nacelle. Juxtapose that with the Falcon, where the engines are completely self-contained at the wingtips, and the props have no nacelle. But the interesting thing is the Falcon, and I kind of brought this up in my last video, actually still has those fuselage engines. And both of them have a chin-mounted gun, both of them have the forward-looking sensor underneath the cockpit, and the cockpits themselves look very, very similar. And really, if you watch the movie and you look how you fight with the Falcon and Halo, they both kind of have the same style and feel for their controllability. But it's not surprising to see why the Falcon might be based off, because like I said, Avatar came out a year before and was such a massive impact in America that it's kind of easy to connect those dots. And that's not to say that there's anything like uninspirational or Bungie was being lazy. That's just kind of art in general. Sometimes something comes out and has such an influence on you that it in itself starts to play a role in your own art. And really, I personally think it's kind of cool to see how Halo's designs may have been influenced by movies that James Cameron made. I mean, they were very wildly popular movies, but in many ways, like Halo, in its own right, has grown up to become an icon of gaming. I mean, everybody who's a teenager or older in the early to mid 2000s knows exactly what Halo is. And so, although James Cameron's movies may have been inspirational in Halo's designs, Halo itself, I feel like, has gotten to that point where these designs now are classics of their own. But understanding where something came from, in my opinion, is still kind of cool to know. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's kind of more of a one-off. It just, after watching the movie, I felt really inspired to kind of like go out there. I also happen to have a lot of free time right now because I have nothing to do. But in the meantime, I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend. Happy holidays. Take care and be safe.